Hello, everybody. We're getting started with webinar 18, Coordinating Across Plans. I'm Kiana Park from Spy Palm Partners, and I'll be your facilitator for today's webinar. So this is, as I mentioned, webinar 18, and this is a series sponsored by both Federal Highways and AASHTO. And today's webinar's topic is titled Coordinating Across Plans. We have presented webinars in this series every 2 months going back to 2012 on a variety of topics in asset management. For more information on this webinar series, visit tam-portal.com, then click TAM Events in the main menu to register for any webinar, and you'll also find archives of previous webinars and links to both videos and slides, including today's webinar. They're posted on that site. You can also download today's slides on the webinar menu that you have on your screen. This is the new home of the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, and for information on the subcommittee, visit tamportal.com and click on Subcommittee on Asset Management under the About menu. If you have any suggestions on future webinar topics or have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's Q&A feature. We'll answer questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So just as you have a thought, please just enter them and we'll just queue them up, and we're going to take them in the order that they're entered. All right, so phone logistics. Throughout today's webinar, the audience will be muted by default and only the presenters will be audible. Presenters should be sure to use their phone's mute button to unmute their phones in order to be heard. That covers the logistics for today's webinar, so I'd like to turn it over to Steve Gay of Federal Highways for a brief introduction. Steve.
Thank you, Yana. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone joining us today. I'm Steve Gay. I'm lead of FHWA's Asset Management Team. We've had a great response to today's topic with over 175 people registering for this webinar. And we have 4 excellent speakers on the agenda today, so I'm just going to say a few words of introduction. Federal Highway Administration, in cooperation with the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management and the Transportation Asset Management Expert Task Group, or TAM-ETG, is very pleased to sponsor this webinar series. We feel it's a great way to bring people together around a series of important topics and to connect with the asset management community. Christopher is going to say a few words about the TAM-ETG, so I want to take a quick moment to encourage you to view the asset management overview video that the ETG helped sponsor. The URL is on the slide in front of you. You can download the slides to access the link directly, or you can go to YouTube and search for Transportation Asset Management, and you can also access it from the Federal Highway website by going to just Google FHWA Asset Management. I just want to acknowledge the good work of the ETG. They've helped us, AASHTO, TRB, identify key issues that are needed by the transportation community in the whole area of asset management. Their efforts are really appreciated. Next slide. FHWA Office of Asset Management is helping agencies extend the impact of asset management decision-making by improving multi-agency coordination, including coordination against plans. I know so often you see issues like asset management, performance management, the long-range transportation plan, STIP, and how all these fit together. I think today's presentations address the relationship between a transportation asset management plan and these issues, and I'm sure as time goes on, we'll be able to get into a lot more depth to address some of these issues. Presenters will address specific linkages between plans and discuss the benefits of strengthening these connections. Now I encourage you to follow up by visiting us online for more information. please go to, like I said, the FHWA Asset Management website at the link you see on your screen. And finally, I just want to say that you're going to enjoy today's presentations. I've had a look at them, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy them. Let me pass it back to Yana of Spy Pond Partners to give an overview of today's webinar, review today's agenda, and to introduce our speakers. Thank you. Yana?
Thanks, Steve. Today's presentation includes 4 perspectives on coordinating across plans, highlighting the role of transportation asset management plans in multi-agency coordination. Our presenters can speak to the experiences of agencies already realizing some of the benefits of these efforts. Presentations will highlight both successful approaches and some important lessons learned. The purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are building workplace knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to improving coordination across plans, understanding specific applications to agency TAM programs, beginning to apply this knowledge in order to answer how can transportation asset management plans be coordinated with other transportation plans, what benefits can states and MPOs expect by enhancing multi-agency coordination across transportation asset management, what are the key lessons learned for agencies seeking to improve multi-agency coordination as part of their TAM program, and of course, most importantly, share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge. For the agenda today, I will introduce our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, our first speaker will hear from Chris Avila of Waco, Texas MPO, who will provide us with an introduction and overview. Then we'll have a presentation from Mark Nelson of the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Then we'll have Mike Salvato of the New York State Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And then our final speaker for the day will hear from Sui Tan of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then we'll have Q&A at the end. So just another reminder that as you have questions that pop into your heads as you're listening to our presenters, please enter the questions into the Q&A feature. And in response to the most frequently asked questions we've got in the past, yes, we'll make the slides and video available after today's webinar at tam-portal.com. One final note for our presenters: in order to keep things moving along on schedule, I will chime in to remind you when you have 5 minutes remaining in your allotted time. And with that, I'd like to welcome Chris Avila, who is introducing today's webinar. Chris is the director of the Waco Metropolitan Planning Organization in Waco, Texas. He is the deputy director of TEMPO, the Association of Texas MPOs, and the immediate past chair of the Association of MPOs Technical Committee. Chris is also a member of the TAM Expert Task Group. And now let's welcome Chris.
All right, well, good afternoon. And for those of you on the West Coast, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on coordinating plans with the asset management process. Before we get started in providing a brief overview, which I hope will frame the discussion of today's presentations, I'd like to just put in a brief plug about the expert task group that Steve mentioned earlier. This task group is charged with not only identifying the state of practice with asset management, but also advancing that state of the practice. It is composed of representatives from a number of different agencies, each practicing asset management in different respects. We have representatives from various state DOTs, MPOs, transit agencies, our federal partners, and we have folks from Canada and Australia also on the ETG, with those countries really moving out ahead on asset management and providing us a different perspective on how other countries are practicing asset management. In addition to advancing the state of the practice, the ETG is also charged with communicating that practice as a best practice for managing the various assets that we are charged with maintaining, and also communicating the work of the ETG to the broader community. So if we go to the next slide here, just to kind of make sure that everyone is on the same page here, I would like to just kind of real briefly describe what asset management is. And what we're looking at is basically a process of how we're, in essence, managing assets in a cost-effective manner. How are we basically taking the assets that we have and with while trying to minimize cost and using the best practice for getting the most bang for the buck, if you will, how are we then making sure that those assets last as long as their useful life will permit. In addition, what we also want to do is also mention that MAP 21 does have a requirement for state DOTs and public transportation agencies to develop an asset management plan. And so if you have more interest in that aspect, I would certainly recommend that you go to the U.S. Department of Transportation website to look up some of the draft rulemaking that has been put out on those particular topics. So if we move to the next slide, what I'd like to do is just kind of give a brief overview of several different planning processes and a number of different plans that are kind of on the landscape that asset management can help inform. The first one is going to be kind of looking at a 30,000-foot level, and what we're looking at are long-range plans, which on the metropolitan level maybe we're also referred to as a metropolitan transportation plan. But these are plans that are generally 20 to 25 years in scope. You're going to identify some guiding principles or some overarching goals that the region is interested in accomplishing through this plan. And at least at the MPO scale, they're going to actually identify specific projects for which federal dollars are intended to be used for. And the requirement is that those projects must be identified within the plan before they can actually proceed to implementation. Long-range plans are modal neutral in the aspect that these plans must address the needs of all modes that are applicable for a certain metropolitan area. But perhaps the largest challenge that these plans have is that they are fiscally constrained against a realistic estimate of future revenues. So if you have projects that may be great projects, but you do not have any idea of how you're going to pay for those projects over the next 25 years, they cannot be included in these plans. And then, of course, for those areas that are designated non-attainment for air quality, the projects that are part of these plans also have to demonstrate that they are accomplishing the regional air quality or regional objectives that have been identified to improve air quality within those regions. Now, on the statewide side, you do have a similar process, although many plans at the statewide level may only be policy-based. There are some plans that are identifying specific projects. However, if it's a policy-based plan, you also don't necessarily have a fiscally constrained document. And in some cases, states have also chosen to do a needs-based plan rather than constraining themselves to some estimate of future revenues. And then you have the suggestion, which I would argue is probably ought to be more than just a suggestion, but I would argue it's a very good idea that the efforts of MPOs need to be coordinated with state DOTs and vice versa. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, we come down from, say, 30,000 feet down to something that's a little bit closer to the ground. And we have a number of studies which are now starting to look at more specific aspects of the transportation system, or maybe a specific corridor. Here we're looking at much more detailed information about specific assets, perhaps along a corridor, or in the case of, say, public transportation, we're looking at what kind of services are being provided, maybe even what kind of infrastructure is in terms of rolling stock, or perhaps stations, shelters, etc. Here we're making recommendations of things like conceptual design. What should the corridor look like in the future compared to what we have right now? And there are a number of recommendations that come out of these studies to identify what kind of changes ought to occur in terms of assets, whether it's changes to what's existing. Maybe it's a recommendation not to change anything. One of the challenges here is that these studies oftentimes are not necessarily fiscally constrained. So you do have that challenge when you start looking at identifying projects for your long-range plan, and when you're starting to look at implementation phases of some of these projects. Which leads us to the next slide, which is when we're actually looking at implementation. At the MPO scale, this would be the Transportation Improvement Program. And for those of you who have a familiarity with a CIP process at a municipal, county, or maybe a township level, where you're actually programming expenditures of capital for capital projects, this is very similar to that process. TIPs are usually 4 to 5 years in scope, and kind of a little bit nuanced change from the long-range plan. You actually have to have a formal commitment for funding for these projects, as opposed to just an estimate of future revenues. You do have a statewide TIP, which basically copies and pastes what the MPOs have adopted into the statewide TIP, and then you have the inclusion of rural projects that are outside of the MPO areas also incorporated into the statewide TIP. So you have a number of different moving parts here, and one of the challenges is that you have several different decision-making processes occurring with each one of these. In some cases, the decision makers may be the same. In other cases, the decision makers may be a different set of policymakers. And so if we go to the next slide here, what we see is that we already know that MPOs and states are now under a requirement to begin reporting conditions for various parts of our transportation network. Whether it may be congestion, it may be state of good repair, it may be crash data. For those of us not attainment, it may be an air quality report. And then we know that we're also going to be required to identify targets for these metrics as well. And so the question that comes up is, especially considering that we don't have an infinite level of resources, we don't have really enough maybe to address what we would consider even a satisfactory condition. How are those decisions being made about which assets to devote resources towards, which assets maybe need to wait for another day or another funding program? And how are we deciding what's strategically important here? This is where asset management can be very beneficial in informing the planning process and informing the larger budgetary process of what is the overall condition of our networks, what is perhaps the most critical elements of our networks that perhaps need more immediate attention. And then likewise, the planning process can help inform those who are at the who are managing those assets. What are the strategic concerns of our policymakers and decision makers? So if we move on to the next slide here. So I will leave it at that point here. Basically, to give an hopefully this has given everyone a brief overview of the planning process and how this can relate to the asset management process. And we have 3 speakers today who have actually practiced some of this coordination, and I'm sure that you will find their presentations very beneficial as we move forward with this discussion. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Hanai, and thank you for listening today.
Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Now we'll hear from Mark Nelson of the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Mark's the Program Manager for Statewide Planning and Transportation Data Analysis for MnDOT. Mark has 20 years of experience in transportation planning, research, and project and program management. He's been with MnDOT for the last 12 years. He's a member of the MnDOT Transportation Research and Innovation Group, which is the governing board of the MnDOT State Research Program. Prior to joining MnDOT, Mark has worked for Washington State Department of Transportation, Iowa State University Center for Transportation Research and Education, and the URS Corporation. Now I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Viana. I appreciate the opportunity to talk again today about the work that we've done. I'm going to focus on our experience as one of the pilot states that developed a draft transportation asset management plan prior to the release of the notice of proposed rulemaking. So fresh off the passage of MAP 21, Louisiana, the state of New York, and Minnesota, with a great deal of support from the Federal Highway Administration, dived in and started developing what we consider to be an asset management plan. So I'm going to talk about that today and how it affects or how it fits with our planning process here at Minnesota. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. And what you see here is what we refer to as our family of plans. To best understand the role of the asset management plan, it helps to really understand the context. At MnDOT, we have this family of plans that collectively moves us towards what we call our 50-year vision. And just quickly, our vision is that Minnesota's multimodal transportation system maximizes the health of people, the environment, and our economy. The vision goes much further than that, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I'll stop at that. Our statewide vision is really the guiding document for all of the planning work that we do as a state. The next level down, and what was mentioned in the last presentation, is our policy plan, or our statewide multimodal transportation plan. Below that, you'll see modal and system plans, and here you'll see a collection of a great number of plans ranging from our Greater Minnesota Transit Investment Plan through our Ports and Waterway Plan. The one thing these all have in common is that they're linked to the vision. From the user's perspective or from a reader's perspective, they should see the vision and the links between our investment and our system management decisions and our vision, as well as our policies in the statewide multimodal plan, and they should all reflect one direction. The other thing that all of these plans have in common, which is a little bit different than the asset management plan, is that they're developed with a great deal of input and feedback from the public and our stakeholders. So these are heavily vetted by our stakeholders and the public. Next slide, please. So if we were to zero in from the last slide on just the statewide highway investment plan, this is what it would look like. Again, we have the vision on the left and the multimodal plan, which really sets policy directions and our highest level performance measures. We then have our capital plan, which is a statewide highway investment plan. And for Minnesota, that is a fiscally constrained 20-year plan. From that plan, we develop our 4-year STIP, our State Transportation Improvement Program, which ultimately results in construction. The Transportation Asset Management Plan, as we've used it, has really informed our State Highway Investment Plan as well as our STIP. And that's really the scope within which we deal with it. For us, the asset management plan or asset management refers to the maintenance of the assets that are already in place. So it's maintaining the condition of the assets that are already in place. It's not expansion, it's not safety, it's really about the assets. Next slide. Next slide, please. So the impact of the TAMP, well, for the statewide highway investment plan, it really has a couple of different impacts. First of all, it's the breadth of the highway investment plan. We've added assets as a result of the TAMP. We've looked beyond just pavement and bridge and broad discussion of other assets to a more detailed look at some of our other assets as a state, and I'll get a bit more into that in a second. Also, depth. We're better informing the trade-off decisions that come with the development of a statewide highway investment plan. And finally, an area where we're really just getting started is the link of our capital investments and our operational budget needs. So typically our highway investment plan is a capital plan, but the implications go well beyond future capital investment and also affect how we invest on the capital side will affect our operational costs, as well as any of you that are in the work for a transportation agency would be aware. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Again, as I mentioned, one of the primary purposes of the highway investment plan is to communicate our capital investment priorities, and public involvement is a foundational piece of this. This is the one area, the highway investment plan, because it's fiscally constrained, where we have trade-off discussions, where we start to look at not just our asset management needs, but it's a little cryptic here, but also our other priority policy objectives as a state. So if you look at this, the green slices of the pie are all asset management. So PC stands for pavement condition, BC stands for bridge condition, and RI stands for roadside infrastructure. This is from our last plan. We're actually now in the process of updating this plan once again. But as you can see, over a 20-year period, just maintaining the assets we have takes up the majority of our capital budget, or our estimated capital funding. So it's a big part of that, and it's going to affect all of the other things that we do, from safety to mobility in the metropolitan area to mobility throughout the state. Bike infrastructure, pet infrastructure, these are all categories that vie for funding as we put together this statewide highway investment plan. Next slide, please. And just quickly, historically, pavement and bridge are two areas where we've always had performance measures and condition information. We're able to link our investment levels to future condition. So we can say if we spend $100 on pavement, we would expect this outcome in this amount of time. And that's true with bridge as well. So with us, we do a performance-based plan, and we spend a lot of time then really talking about what are our targets, what are we trying to accomplish, and what is the investment need to meet those targets. So bridge and pavement have always been a solid part, a big part of our statewide highway investment plan. Next slide, please. Next. There we are. So with the asset management plan, we really took the opportunity, because we really have been doing a lot with pavement and bridge, to expand the scope of what we talk about when we talk about assets. So here you see a few things circled, everything from pavement markings to lighting. In our first asset management plan, we included high mast tower lights, deep stormwater tunnels, culverts, and overhead sign structures. So what does that mean to include them? We went much further with assessing risks in these areas. We inventoried condition to the extent that we could. And we, again, to the extent that we had good data, we set measures, condition measures, and targets for each of these areas. So in the past, we've always had money set aside for other infrastructure, or we have at least for the last couple of plans, but it was really based on the estimated percentage of funding that we would spend on a highway project, how much would go to the other infrastructure. What's happened in recent years because of the pressure on our capital budget is not everything is being addressed through large construction projects, and large construction projects aren't happening as frequently. So we really have to start honing in on managing these assets separately and additionally to the pavement and bridge assets. Next slide, please. Next. There we are. Thank you. So this is a folio of our roadside infrastructure condition. This gives you a sense. Again, we have 13 different investment categories, as was reflected in that pie chart a couple of slides ago. This is just roadside infrastructure. So as part of our planning process, as part of our outreach to our stakeholders and the public, as part of our discussion with the leadership of our agency and ultimately with the legislature, we talk about funding levels and the impact of those funding levels on the condition of our assets. So if you look down on the left side, you see our investment level over a 20-year period, investment description, outcomes, what we would expect to happen at that investment level in terms of real numbers. So for example, in the first column, poor culverts increased to more than 15% as an example. Risks, we talk about the risks that are that we would realize at these different investment levels and the level to which it is a risk, high, medium, or low. And then finally, we identify some investment strategies. So prior to the highway investment, or excuse me, the Transportation Asset Management Plan, we couldn't go very far with this. There were a lot of assumptions. Here we can now start to quantify the impact of investment at different levels. I think this really makes the point with our stakeholders that it's more than just pavement and bridges. So this is something that, in my opinion, has really been a step forward for our highway investment plan as a result of our asset management plan. Next slide. Ultimately, the objective of asset management is to improve efficiency throughout the service life of an asset. Life cycle costs are something that are considered when scoping projects and have been for quite some time. But what we did with the asset management plan was to kind of aggregate that and to maybe average it. As you can see here, it's dollars per lane mile for this is actually pavement. So here we have an example of what we typically would spend over the life of an asset. I believe these are annualized costs on the left. And then, no, actually that's per lane mile. So that's $410,000 per lane mile we would expect to spend versus kind of the ideal, which is really described in our pavement design guideline, and then worst first. So it gives people a sense of the fact that there are many different routes we can go as an agency in terms of how we invest in an asset, and we can get different outcomes. There is value in investing at the right level. So this was a really important part of our asset management plan. Next slide. Another area where we've made some great advances, not necessarily as part of the asset management plan, but since the asset management plan's development, is tracking labor, equipment, and material costs for our internal forces as they mostly we're talking about reactionary maintenance, but as they address the needs of the system. So we know there are implications, as I mentioned before, of investing or not investing in a mile of roadway, but we've never really quantified that on the operational side. So that's something we are really trying to do, and we hope to have some estimates as we move forward into the next, as we move forward with this statewide highway investment plan. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here we're talking about, again, the outcomes for different funding levels. One of the things we want to add for this is kind of the impact on our operational budget of funding or not funding. So if our payments go from 5 to 10% poor in a certain category, what should we anticipate spending additionally for reactive maintenance, for pothole patching, for example? And that money, if we do spend that money, then that takes away from other operations and maintenance priorities that we have. So we want to make that link between the capital and our operational budget. Secondly, one of the areas that we're going to talk more about coming out of this out of the asset management plan is remaining service life. So at different funding levels, we're going to have impacts on the average remaining service life of that asset. So that's something, again, it's not just the condition. We've always talked about the condition. At this level, we'll have 5% poor or 10% poor. But what is the remaining service life? And it allows then decision makers and the public to really understand that it's not just the condition in any given point in time, but the cost associated with maintaining it at different funding levels. Next slide. So again, what changes have we seen as a result of the asset management plan? Improved understanding of roadside infrastructure, as I highlighted, including inventory and establishment of condition and measures and targets. Communication of life cycle cost considerations to decision makers, and finally a better understanding of relationship between capital investment and maintenance or operating costs. These are three areas that I really wanted to highlight. These are areas where you could actually make an impact right away and really help decision makers as they consider the trade-offs that ultimately have to be made. Next slide. The one area that we're still, as many of you know, we're still waiting on the final rules, or in the case of system performance measures, the preliminary rules or the proposed rules for a lot of what came out of MAP 21, and this will affect how we make decisions and actually how we make trade-offs going forward. In fact, for the highway investment plan and asset management, I think pavement and bridge performance measures will have as big, if not a much larger impact on our asset management than the asset management plan rules themselves. And then system performance measure is more about mobility, reliability, and delay, as we understand. But that being an unknown is a challenge for us as we make these trade-offs. So again, everything's related. You're not looking at asset management in a vacuum. You're looking at asset management in relation to all of the other priorities that you have as an agency or as a state or metropolitan area. Next slide. So with that, I'll say thank you. You can see my email address and telephone number on the bottom, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And again, please submit your questions if you have any for Mark. Our next presentation is from Michael Salvato of New York State Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Michael is currently the Director and Program Executive for Enterprise Information, Asset Management, and Strategic Partnerships at the MTA. In this role, he manages a portfolio of programs driving changes to realize more value from public assets. Michael is also the chairman of the U.S. chapter of the Institute of Asset Management, advancing the interests of asset owners and managers in the U.S. He was a voting member of the U.S. delegation project committee that wrote the new ISO 55000 standard for asset management and its associated documents released in January of 2014. Among other accomplishments, Michael is also a research professor at the Urban Infrastructure Institute of New York University Polytechnic School of Engineering, where he's applying research on information and communication technologies for intelligent infrastructure, smart cities, and urban innovation. There's much more to say, but I'll leave it there in the interest of time, and now I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Steve. Mark, I really enjoyed watching your presentation. I particularly liked your slide on the condition and the investment levels and the expected performance on that. I hope to learn more from you on that. Let me do a little kind of expectation setting, level setting. I'm not going to talk a lot about coordination across plans or agencies. The MTA has multiple agencies. Go to the next slide. The MTA has 6 operating agencies, and just coordinating amongst those operating agencies is a challenge in itself. What I'm going to share with you is what we call our asset management improvement strategy. It's different from a transit asset management plan or a transportation asset management plan, in that this is all about how we plan to put in place the capabilities to do good asset management. It's driven a lot from the operations perspective, and it's more about improvements, improving our capabilities than it is the actual asset management itself. I'll talk about how we plan to do that. And the other aspect I want to just kind of, again, level set a little bit is that we see asset management itself as a journey, as somewhat of a cliche, but for us it's become a large organizational transformation program sponsored by the chairman. We have an executive committee with 5 presidents on it, a chairman, the CFO, and they're all driving it from a organizational change perspective, which I think is a little bit unique in terms of what the MTA is trying to do. This kind of outlines our organization. We cover the whole, the New York and Connecticut region of the New York, New Jersey metropolitan region. So we have over 15 million people in our catchment area. We have over 70,000 about 70,000 employees. We're delivering services that affect the lives of over 15 million people. Our operating budget is around $16 billion a year, and our capital program is right now our 2015 to 2019 capital program is approximately $28 billion. And I'll note that it's unfunded. We still haven't finalized the funding program a year into it. It just kind of gives you, and I bet you it's not unfamiliar to you guys in terms of the policy and politics of financing your capital program. Next slide. So we did a little exercise last year where we got some accountants to put a value on our assets, and we concluded using KPMG that the replacement value of our assets is $1 trillion. We have and operate 6,300 subway cars and over 2,400 commuter cars. That gives us more cars, we're managing more rail cars than all other railroads, commuter rails, and subways in the entire United States. Our bus fleet at 56,000 comprises the largest fleet in the United States. Some of our other assets are, we have 75 shops, yards, and depots. We manage 713 stations. We have over 2,000 miles of tracks. We manage 9 major bridges and tunnels, which include the Tappan Zee. We have 35 power stations, etc. And as you can imagine, managing $1 trillion worth of public assets is complex and costly. I guess it's why the MTA is really kind of aggressively pursuing world-class asset management practices. The modern MTA, as we know it, was formed in 1982 with our first capital program, and we've been following a condition-based investment program for over nearly 35 years. And we see asset management as the next business model for us, and that's how we're pursuing it. Next slide. So really the brutal reality for the MTA is that the expectations are much higher around us, given customers' expectations about smart technology and on-timeness. It's becoming increasingly complex to manage our system. Again, a lot having to do with the introduction of information technology into our systems. Our funding is limited. As I said, we have an unfunded $28 billion capital program, and our risks are rising, in particular with things like climate change and security risk with terrorism. So our chairman is all in. I mean, this is his not his pet project, but this is what they call his legacy project. He has mandated, and this mandate goes back, like I said, at least 3 years, and we've been working on it for 5 probably, that we put in place an effective management system. So when we talk about asset management, we're primarily talking about the management system. And as Mark showed, to do exactly what Mark did in terms of showing the effect of different investments levels on our performance, both capital and operating, and also the risks. So we also, safety really is a key part of his vision of asset management. And so we, before, as part of MAP 21, but this is part of our philosophy from the very beginning, was making a connection between safety and asset management and making those two kind of as much possible synonymous. And it's another reason why we're looking at the ISO standards, because we believe it's kind of an integrated management system, an integrated safety management system with an integrated asset management system, with an integrated environmental management system, et cetera. And we think the ISO structure really does provide a good framework for that. Next slide. And so, as I said, we're all committed to delivering quality service as cost effectively as possible. And we believe that asset management is really key to that. And so we've been putting in place steps to put in the new capabilities, the business processes, and the technologies that will enable us to do asset management, because we don't believe we really have that skill set in-house today. But the main thing we realized is really what this is driving this is organizational change. So as we talk about the program in the MTA, as I mentioned before, we look at it as a change program primarily. I mean, we do look at it that way. And so, next slide. We've put and established these following objectives for the asset management program. Managing risk, again, managing operational risks are kind of key for us. Managing failure or reliability is another element. The safety component is really important to us. Making sure that we provide a good customer experience, and then managing for resiliency and climate change. And again, this is why we're looking at it as a management system, and we're looking for a system that will help produce results around these goals and objectives. Next one. So as I mentioned, what I'm presenting here now, everything else I say from here on now kind of gives you insights into what we call our asset management improvement strategy. And so if you look at the diagram and you look at the left and you look at the green box, that's the document that we're talking about here. Prior to that, in October 2013, we issued a policy, an asset management policy that instructed all the operating agencies to put in place an asset management improvement program. So if you see in the bottom blue box on the left, the policy instructed them to do that improvement plan. And each of the agencies have completed gap assessments based on ISO 55000 and other best practices, and put in roadmaps, 5 to 10 year roadmaps that would help them move up the maturity curve. And they use the IAM standards for maturity assessments as that framework. If you look to the right where it says how to ensure we get there, as a program manager, we're managing this as a change program. I think we have over 150 projects that we're managing across the agencies. Some of them technology, some of them training, some of them business process change, some of them putting just in our transit asset management plan, but each one is being managed as a project. And what I'm really looking forward to putting in place, and we're really not there, is our asset management manual. which basically describes the practice of asset management at the MTA. Like I said, we haven't done that yet. I will talk about the dark blue boxes in a second as part of a later slide, but that's really what asset management in that middle box, in those middle set of boxes. I will kind of do one commercial. So as mentioned, I'm the chair of the U.S. chapter of the Institute of Asset Management. We just released what we call our Asset Management Anatomy, version 3, which was updated to reflect the ISO standards, ISO 55000. It's really a really good document, and I would encourage everyone to kind of visit the IAM.org and download a free copy, again, of the Asset Management Anatomy version 3, which kind of explains this kind of framework. Next slide. So to some degree, this page is our strategy. Everything I will say from here on in will just put another layer of information associated with it, with this. To some degree, so what I will say is that there's really kind of three components of it. There's setting the direction, setting the goals and objectives, elaborating on the executive's visions and requirements and their decision criteria is something that we need to put in place, and we need to do a better job at that. And we are working aggressively at that. The second is what is our value creation chain. So we plan and deliver assets that enable the operations of our organization. So we're committed to kind of improving our value chain, and that is enabled by information technology, and the skill sets of our people. So we built out a strategy for improvement around these 5 areas. Again, I'll kind of pick up on the ISO standard. I think why the ISO standard is important because it moves asset management from a kind of an engineering function to a management function. And it really kind of puts in place the management structures that enable organizations to control their risk and manage their and realize value from their assets. And it does through by recognizing the importance of things like context, leadership, implementation, support functions, performance management, and continuous improvement. So we believe the reason why we just didn't dive into asset management is that we felt that we really didn't have the capabilities to have a mature asset management system. We believe if we were to successfully implement on these strategies, that this will provide us the capabilities to have a world-class asset management system that will really drive down the cost of delivering services, make it completely more transparent as to how we are spending the money and how we are realizing value from that, and how we will impact the overall performance. Next slide.
Michael, 5-minute warning.
Okay, I got a few more slides. Thank you. So this is the strategic direction. So this is what we would consider as part of the transit asset management plans. At a corporate level, right now we're doing an exercise defining what we call the strategic business objectives with that leadership team. That'll define our strategic asset management plan. Again, so this is kind of at a corporate level. We're not an operating function at headquarters. That and the information strategy that's driving a fairly significant investment in information technology will provide a basic framework. And then individual operating agencies are required to put together asset management strategies, network strategies, and asset class strategies and plans at the individual asset level. I think the thing I want to mention about here is that, as Mark said, it's connecting the operating expense and the capital expense, but also introducing continuous improvement, the use of information technology, training, et cetera, kind of within the context of those plans to drive performance. Next. An important concept within asset management, you guys, there's two, is creating a line of sight between the corporate direction and the actual activities, the wrench turning, and the other is the plan, do, check, act life cycle. And so what we try to do is define a planning framework that enables us to align different levels of the company, from headquarters down to the maintainers themselves, and give them their each planning, plan, do, check, act cycle, and try to figure out ways to align that and use these documents that are defined on the right as the kind of the registering documents, and on the left to use information systems to support that. Next. As I said, what we're finding at the MTA is that operations are driving our asset management program right now. They have really important needs to embrace these practices, but from their perspective, they really look at it from an asset, actually from a maintenance management and a reliability perspective. And what we're trying to do now is educate our company, our business, around the practices necessary for reliable assets. And we've adopted or using uptime elements kind of coming out of Reliability Web and the crew down there as a basic language for introducing the practices around reliability, RCM, reliability center maintenance, FHWA, criticality analysis, et cetera, as well as practices around condition monitoring, monitoring of oil and other things that kind of drive our assets. We're also trying to introduce and support the improvement of our capital program delivery using asset management by looking at the integration or the transition from capital to operations as a key area, the introduction of RAMS analysis into the, which is reliability, availability, maintainability, and safety analysis into design criteria, and introducing more kind of information technology like building information, BIM, and things like that. Next slide. You know, I think one of the key things to understand from my perspective about asset management is that it is really enabled by so many information technologies that are now available to us. And it's also kind of taking a systems thinking, systems approach to that information technology. So we established these goals and this process for information and information management. We're making significant investments in information technology, putting in place a enterprise-wide enterprise asset management system that will complement our ERP, our enterprise resource planning system, and that's going to be shared across multiple agencies, which is in its own right a revolution. One of the things that we're finding is that the asset hierarchy and discussions around the asset hierarchy right now is quite interesting. And we believe it's the backbone. And one thing we've done is we've adopted ISO 14224 as our standard for our asset hierarchy, and we've gotten that. We took that from, of all places, oil and gas industry, and we liked it because of its focus on reliability. And we also follow, again, the IAM standards for asset information management, and they have a kind of a hierarchy around practices around that. We actually shared our asset management information strategy with Nova Comet and in an international peer review, and they said if we were to execute effectively what we said we would do, we'd move from kind of the lowest quadrant of our peers to the highest quadrant of our peers within 5 to 7 years. And so it kind of gave us validation that we were doing the right thing. Last one. And really, if I said that the asset hierarchy is the backbone, organizational change is really the heart of our program. What we're really doing is we're taking an organization that was kind of modeled in 1950s style hierarchical structures that were obsolete by the time they even put them in place in our organization in the 80s. And we're trying to move to something that's more integrative, process-driven with great information technologies to support that those are revolutionary changes in organizational structure. And it really takes kind of leadership at all levels. As I mentioned, the chairman and all the presidents are really now driving this process and driving the change, but it does take leadership at all levels. So we've seen leadership happening really at the, at the maintainer level, where union members are participating in some of these changes now, and we see it all up and down the food chain from, again, from maintainers to supervisors to our chief officers to our vice presidents, our assistant vice presidents, again, our president, the chairman, and the executive team. So that's how we see the asset management program. Again, it's consistent with the ISO standard, because what the ISO standard says is that primarily driving this is the organizational culture that's driven by leadership helps define what asset management is. And so we've sort of embraced that approach. Next slide. Just to kind of wrap up, so we try to categorize the benefits. We see them both direct, meaning those that can have direct financial implications for our organization through reductions in the operating costs, a greater utilization of our assets, or greater reduction in our capital spend per asset performance. And then ultimately, we also see all the indirect benefits that are kind of once removed from the financials, improvements in performance, risk. We really believe in the importance of transparency in this, transparency in basically having repeatable work practices across the company, but also having transparency in our decision making, so that people can see how we are utilizing the money. Again, I want to compliment Mark on what he said before, because I believe that's really the core of it. And then we are tying this, as was mentioned before, to the triple bottom line the best we can. And so the last slide. As I mentioned, we're managing this as a program, so people have different roles than their day-to-day jobs. So most of these roles are part of their day job, but this is within the context of their program manager. We have an executive committee. We have a sponsor from each one of our agencies that are the accountable person making the decisions on behalf of their executives. I'm the program executive, so I'm kind of the point person, kind of the pivot person. Each of our agencies has put in place a program manager, and in some places have put in program management teams. We have a growing partnership with MnDOT, in which we're doing integrated project delivery, which is a new concept around here. And we really engage labor, procurement, audit, et cetera, kind of as part of the team as well. So we're really kind of doing fun and interesting things, and we're really taking a kind of interesting approach to asset management. And I said, this isn't even doing the asset management. This is all the work we felt we needed to do just to get into the position where we would be able to do world-class asset management. But we are moving. We're moving really quickly at this particular point. We're at a little pivotal point this year where we're moving sort of like testing and planning and complete our gap assessments and roadmaps, where we're executing multi-million-dollar projects. As I said, we have about 150 projects. Some of them are, in the millions of dollars, and we're executing on them now and sort of moving into that program. So that's the MTA's asset management improvement strategy.
Thank you, Michael. For our final presentation, we will hear from Sui Tan of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the San Francisco Bay Area. Sui is a program manager at MTC in charge of Street Saver, a transportation asset management software that has helped over 40 local agencies in better maintaining their streets and roads network. He's been in the transportation engineering industry for 20+ years and specializes in transportation asset management. Now I'll turn it over to Sui.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Yona, for the introduction. And before I begin, I would like to thank AASHTO and FHWA for the opportunity to speak to you about putting your TAM into actions. So playbook for today. So basically, I'm going to be helping you to connect the dots. So from a TAM plan, that's in our TAM approach, that we have what we call the maintenance needs assessment, as well as performance measures that's built into on our TAM approach, and then how this information being linked to how we do our regional transportation plan. And as in there, I'll talk about our investment policy, the fix it first, as well as what target that we use. And then finally, then I'm going to touch on the new act, which is the Fixing America's Surface Transportation, or the MAP 21 requirements regarding how we do the coordinating with our state agencies, Caltrans, as far as HPMS reporting. Next slide, please. So kind of putting it in context, for those of you not sure where MTC is, we are in the San Francisco Bay Area region. In our region, we have 7.4 million people. Our jurisdiction, we have 9 counties and 100 cities. And we primarily taking care of, not necessarily we maintain the local streets and roads, but in our region, we have 43,000 lane miles of local streets and roads. And as well as within our region, we have 6,850 lane miles of the state highways, which is maintained by the Caltrans. Also, we have 23 transit operators and 7 toll bridges. But we don't own any of these infrastructures that I was mentioning. However, we have to be doing the long-term transportation plan as far as how we're going to be investing for this transportation system. Next slide, please. So why are the local streets and roads a regional concern? Now, as I mentioned earlier, we've been doing asset management since late 80s with the pavement, and we don't really formally have a transportation asset management plan in place. But however, we understand that the local streets and roads support all modes of transportations. As you probably heard this before, every trip starts, at the local streets. Whether or not you're going to work, you're taking the bus, your delivery trucks delivering goods to you, it's all travel on the local street first. And we estimate that there's $40 billion of replacement value for pavement only, and we do have that numbers for the other assets as well. But for the pavement, our conditions in the Bay Areas are really facing steep decline. And what we are afraid of is that the escalating deferred maintenance will jeopardize the funding for all other modes of transportation as far as when we're setting our investment priority in the Bay Area. So currently in the Bay Area for the local streets and roads conditions we have been pretty fortunate. We have been staying at about a PCI of 66. So for those of you who are not sure what is PCI, it's Pavement Condition Index. We use the STMD 6433 standards. It's a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 basically means a brand new pavement. So as I mentioned earlier, we are, 66 is not good. We are, even though we're kind of stagnant, but our conditions is not improving either. And at these conditions, our deferment is going to continue to grow. Next slide, please. So, so you may ask, okay, well, so how do we know? How do we know the region has a PCI of 66? By adopting a TAM approach earlier in the 80s, we're able to perform maintenance needs assessments that help us to answer some of the investment questions, especially on pavement. And we are currently working on including the non-pavement assets. We finished the sign. We're working on curb ramps, and we will be adding more assets to our local agency database, and as well as the local bridges. the local bridges is basically we don't own the database, and it's basically maintained by Caltrain in terms of the database. They do the bridge inspections every year, and they have very accurate and up-to-date bridge information. And all these assets really it facilitate us into this our long-term regional transportation plan discussions in terms of how we're going to invest our funding, our limited funding. Because as you know, as Chris mentioned earlier, this regional transportation plan, even though it's anywhere from 20 to 25 years, but it is fiscally constrained. So we only can program with whatever the money that we have. So for payment, it's very easy for us to do it because all 109 agencies in the Bay Area, they all use Street Saver, which is the program that we developed. Next slide, please. In our TAM, we do include some performance measures, and I'm going to introduce you some of the key performance index that we use in our TAM approach. So the first one we have is the pavement condition index, and this is basically as from the asset management approach. You want to know what's your current conditions. So we annually reporting the Bay Area jurisdiction's conditions. We use the 3 years moving average and to report it. As you can see, the Bay Area currently the benchmark is we are at 66, and we do release the information for each of the 109 jurisdictions. What's the PCI score? That would be down to the level. It's not just the PCI itself, but we also kind of take the approach from the using descriptive conditions like percentage poor or percentage of very good, and also we further break it down into condition in arterials, conditions in collectors, as well as residential. Next slide, please. And here's the other key performance factors with that we have been very successful using this. Basically, it's a pavement preservation index. What this means is that we want to gauge what is the effort of local agencies towards pavement preservations. So in the past, we have developed performance-based funding allocations approach into how we distribute the federal funds that comes to our regions by using pavement preservation index as part of the scoring criteria. So what this means simply is that for each of the agencies, they are basically comparing among themselves. They're not comparing to the peer. The formula is basically using the percentage actual PM over the percentage PM needs. By using the 3 years moving average, we can find out how much work the local agency has done in the last 3 years towards preventive maintenance. And then we measure that over what's the PM needs recommended by the system. So if the ratio is greater than 1, then that means that they are doing a good job towards pavement preservation. Next slide, please. And the sustainability index is basically, and if we are investing at our current level, well, what can we really sustain our assets? So as you can see in the regions, we're only investing about 39%. We're still a long way to go. It's indicative with our pavement condition of 66. But for some other agencies within the Bay Area, really there are a few that are actually be able to sustain their current investments. And so this is a pretty good index to use to gauge how we're doing with maintaining our assets. Next slide, please. And the last one I want to introduce you to the KPI is the backlog over asset values. Basically, this measures what's your current backlog against your net asset values. Could you go back to the previous slide, please? Basically, what this one is telling you is that if you're going to, how much money you need to get to the state of good repair. Basically, basically the backlog is kind of your deferred maintenance. If you can carry all your deferred maintenance, then you'll be able to achieve that state of good repair. So this is kind of the indicator. It tells you how well you're doing, how far you are, or how much money you will need to get to the state of good repair. All right, next slide. So I kind of introduced you all these performance measures. So the next question is that, well, how do we translate this information in the needs assessment that we have done, and then as well as those performance measures into investment policies to facilitate the regional transportation plan discussions? Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, so this long-term transportation plan is how the regions is going to invest in transportation systems while taking care of our economy in our regions, as well as the environmental, and also taking care of our land use. So, but there's a common theme that has been very consistent throughout our long-term transportation plans, which is the fix it first. We want to make sure that regardless of any transportation modes, we want to make sure that we are investing in maintaining what we have. So that's the fix it first maintenance policies. And as we required to do it by a performance-based planning approach, it means that we have to find a ways how we're going to measure our policy on fix it first. Next slide, please. So in our regional transportation plans, of course, we cover many objectives. We cover anywhere from the transit all the way to regional projects, and as well as the local streets and roads. For the local streets and roads, the targets that we set for is to be able to achieve a PCI of 75 in our regions. And now that's not necessarily the state of good repair, but it's something that 75 is something that's achievable, and then we put into our plans. And of course, as you know, we have to do a trade-off analysis where we have to compare with the investment from other modes of transportation, and we have to be fiscally constrained. So if we now go back to the previous slide, please. So if we are investing at what I would call a state of good repair, it means that we'll be investing at least $750 million a year, which equivalent to be about $17 billion for the whole analysis period. In this case, 25 years. But if we maintain it at 75, we will need $650 million a year, or equivalent to $15 billion. Maintaining it at current conditions, we only need $450 million a year, or $11 billion. So during the trade-off analysis, we run all these different type of scenarios because, again, it has to be performance-based planning approach. So we are only able to come up with the money that will help us to maintain at the current conditions, which translates into that PCI of 66 currently. So, so once we have that dollar amount assigned, basically then we'll go through a pool for projects and inform all our local agencies about this amount of money, and then they will start putting in their local projects that would include either preventive maintenance projects or rehab projects, and as well as non-pavement asset projects to be included into our transportation improvement plan, the TIP. Okay, next slide, please. So now, as far as the coordination efforts with the states in respect to the MAP 21 requirements, so far the discussion is ongoing. I think it's going to be getting more in depth next year. So far, Caltrans is performance measures based on RI percent crack routing and faulting. Now, they also realize that target setting is the challenging part because most of the MPO in our region, in California actually, they are lacking complete and current pavement data. So it makes it harder to set up targets as well as knowing what's the current conditions. But I think the most concern local agencies have was because of this, I quote unquote, the skilled pavement condition, because local agencies, as you know, 70% of the agency in California actually use PCI, and they're not using the IRI or percent crack or routing and faulting as a way to measure when they're going to be intervened with their pavement management program, because they use the PCI to drive their preventive maintenance work. So as a result, they are afraid that if this information will report in the HPMS, and if they're ever going to be affecting funding, it could be a very potential issues for the local agency. And also there's going to be an ongoing discrepancies in pavement conditions for different regions. It is just based on the HPMS report versus what they're collecting versus their local conditions in PCI. As I mentioned earlier, then there's going to be further discussions. There is a Transportation Asset Management Advisory Committee that will help to guide the target setting process in California. I also want to mention a little bit on the local bridges side of it. Since California has pretty good data on the bridges, so they'll be able to help set the performance targets much easier versus the coordination effort that's needed on the pavement condition side of it. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the last slide that I want to share with you by Lao Tzu. So the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So hopefully you will be able to take that first step towards integrating your TAM and put it into action. Thank you.
Thanks, Huy. That's a very nice final quote. All right, that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you to all of our presenters, and now let's shift to the Q&A session. So if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A feature of the webinar toolbar, and I'll take them in the order you type them in. So let's start with, this is a question from Alan Ward, and I think it's directed at Michael. An important issue with highway-oriented asset management has been the balancing of investments in different asset categories, such as bridges versus pavements. In a transit system, especially a rail transit system, there is a wide variety of assets that must all work together to permit reliable and quality service. How are metrics such as reliability used to assess the investment needs of one asset group over another? Michael?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is a real challenge, and we've done some pilot programming work in there, but we really don't have the answer yet. We've been introducing, what we did is we introduced the use of decision criteria as a way of normalizing investment decisions, and then building out using kind of programs, what do you call pairwise decision-making programs that kind of can cluster investments so you can show the interrelationship. So what we did in our last capital program, we did a parallel process. We used our traditional process, which is a needs-driven process. And we did a small pilot project where we took all the proposed investments and we set up decision criteria to rank the investments based on things that we talked about, risk, customer experience, whether or not it improves effectiveness or efficiency, whether it was a capacity improvement or things like that. And we found a couple of different things. First of all, one thing we recognize is that I talked to you about those different levels of investment too. So the strategic goals, we believe, at an executive level that set up certain criteria. There are tactical criteria trying to look at the network as a whole, which is really around the operational performance. And then individual assets also have criteria. And I think we kind of concluded that we needed to be respectful of those different levels as well. So we didn't want one level to be more dominant over the other because it's that balanced approach. And so it is these kind of tool sets, these investment decision-making tool sets that are necessary to help do that. I guess, if I remember correctly, something we realized from research, basically it says like the human mind, if you have more than 3 variables, you can't make a decision. And the type of investments that you're making, the type of investments that we're making have so many variables that it makes it almost impossible to make a rational decision because you just get paralyzed. But these tool sets that were developed under, I guess it was developed under Cold War negotiations, so that they developed the techniques, give you some mechanisms to do that. So if you've never used them or you haven't looked into them, I would suggest possibly looking at that.
Thanks, Michael. Let's move on to the next question. This one's for Mark. How are you doing at integrating data across the agencies you're coordinating with, and what do you see as the biggest barriers and challenges?
Well, I guess right now we're just getting started.
This wraps up in a few minutes.
Excuse me. Yeah, we're just getting started with that. As it relates to our asset management plan, our focus is on the trunk highway network exclusively. In Minnesota, unlike San Francisco, the state owns 98+% of the national highway system. So the federal requirement is kind of there. We inform kind of the asset management side of our MPO plans throughout the state. We have one large MPO and 7 smaller MPOs. So we inform that. We are definitely partners in developing that, but we aren't directly sharing data with them on asset condition. So I guess I could take a follow-up on that, but we're not doing that right now. I know that the MPOs are now getting into looking at asset condition data throughout their systems, throughout their locally owned systems that are not part of the NHS. So they're getting ahead with that, and we have worked with the Twin Cities metropolitan area and the Met Council, which is our MPO there, on really talking about the kind of the asset condition or life cycle cost of some of their mobility strategies, such as active traffic management systems throughout the Twin Cities. So we share information, but we aren't necessarily directly sharing kind of raw data in any regard.
Thanks, Mark. This is a question for SWE. What is the composition of the, what was the acronym here, TAMAC, and also can you just explain what KPI stands for?
Sure. I'm kind of low in the food chain, so I'm not in the Transportation Asset Management Advisory Committee, but I'm quite sure that the stakeholders will be including the state officials, the DOTs, as well as the MPOs throughout the regions, and as well as maybe some of the key players in local agencies. Now, as far as the KPI, I'm sorry that I didn't mention that. That's basically the key performance indicator. So it's kind of the performance measures that we use in our TAM.
Thanks, Sui. So the last question is, have you estimated the cost to implement asset management or measured the savings from implementing it? And this is open to anyone who has tried doing this.
This is Mark. I can't give you an estimate. We have an estimate right off the top of my head. I can't give you an estimate of developing the asset management plan. But I think, as someone else pointed out, it's really kind of a change in culture. I think moving forward, our highway investment plan and our other investment plans, for that matter, will be better informed. We're making decisions on large, multi-billion-dollar systems. So I don't know the benefit cost. I don't know if you could do that over a short period of time. There is cost associated, but I would imagine that it's all rather justified if you're making even incremental improvements in the way you're understanding your assets and making investment decisions.
Thanks, Mark. Anybody else have an answer?
Yeah, I'll share a little insight. I'm not going to tell you what the number is, but what I will say is that because we are looking at this as an investment program, a change program, we are managing it as a set of investments. One thing we're trying to do is introduce the idea of managing improvement projects, which may be operational projects, which may be technology projects, as if they were capital projects. So the idea of we're managing our asset management program as if it was a capital program. And so we've been putting in place investment plans. It's just not yet ready for public availing. However, I will kind of categorize some of the expenses, and then I'll also talk a little bit about the benefits themselves. So there are these information technology expenses. I mean, if you're talking about enabling technologies, you're going to have to invest in the information systems to get them up to speed. And we talked about data sharing. There's all the data cleanliness. There's the kind of data gathering that has to be done. So that's a fairly substantial portion of the investments. There are, and I wanted to kind of ask Mark this, I suspect he had to invest in some new skills and new people skills to do kind of the economics of asset management, and I really like the way Sui kind of talked about, to be able to kind of say, they both talked about the ability to kind of calculate those trade-offs. Those are skill sets that we don't have right now. And either training them up or hiring people that can do it is a significant area of investment. So we actually see investing people at the asset level. So you have technicians, technical people that can both interact with the information and as well as are familiar with the assets themselves, kind of at the operational level. We're looking at people at the tactical level who have the skill sets to do the analysis, the investment analysis. And then we have the kind of the managerial functions as well that have to be put in place. And then the third is, and this kind of gets to what Mark's been talking about, it takes investments to put in those plans in place. I mean, it takes to invest in that planning structure is a whole set of skills and people that have to be done as well. So there's sort of those kind of categories of investments. In terms of the benefits, now I'm not going to say we don't know what the economics are right now, but I've looked at this at other places. The people that are able to make these journeys and are able to kind of complete that and get to a point where they're have a real robust asset management system. What I mean is a systematic approach to link their performance to their decision making and all the associated capabilities. So the organizations that I've looked at around the world, they can see a 20% reduction in their CapEx, OpEx, or total X cost. And then for my organization, when we're spending $18 billion a year, you talk to potentially, all right, just say 5% improvement. It's really significant return on the investment.
Thanks, Michael. Any other?
Yes. Sure. This is Sui. So if I can add three things. So in order to access really how much it's going to cost you to set up an asset management program, really the first thing is there are two things that you need to commit to is basically data collection. And data collection could be very expensive. And also the other thing is to have a common use of the software.
Yeah.
And that has been the very hard one to accomplish because, as you know, different agencies, they probably have a different type of software they're already established. And not necessarily all this software, they're using a common key performance index or, some sort of thing that so you can really compare apples to oranges. So that's kind of the first hurdle that you have to get over. And secondly, we're getting benefits, but really, I'll take it from the payment side of it. I mean, you would hear benefits that that says that it's 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 1 to 8, 1 to 20. It's all really depending on what you set up, how you set up in your decision trees. But in overall, there's always benefits. It outweighs the investment that needed to implement it. I mean, we've been committed to maintaining our local streets and roads in our region since in the 80s. We know that the consequences of not maintaining it, and we've been very diligent in trying to maintain the system, and so that it's a cost saving for us. And the last thing. In California, there's a statewide needs assessment for local streets and roads, and I would encourage those that are interested in going to the website, which is safecaliforniastreets.org, and take a look at what's being done in that report.
Thanks, Lee. So that concludes our webinar for today.